Hello all, it's Deborah Krasniansky here from Adai. I'm working together with the Crown Heights Community Council, and we're very blessed to have gotten a grant from the City of New York to address domestic abuse. So with that, we've done several workshops and conference calls and articles regarding domestic abuse and solemn bias in general. We're very blessed to have David Kohn here today talking to us about, is it really abuse? We started off this series with several workshops about what is abuse and how to be helpful. Throughout these months that we've been doing this, several different types of questions have come up. Is this really abuse? Or everyone should know that this is what is occurring is abuse, and people shouldn't misname it. So we're going to debunk some of those myths and talk a lot about that today. So during the call, if you have any questions, you can send them to adai.org/ask-anonymous question, or you can send it to us directly at info@adai.org. So with that, we're going to just jump right into the call. So thank you, David, for joining us.
Sure. Hi, Devorah and everybody. It's a pleasure to be on this evening.
Okay. So I just want to read a couple scenarios that came to our attention over these weeks that we've been doing this work. And I think that kind of explains the types of questions that have been coming up. These are fictitious, kind of a conglomerate of several different conversations. But I want to start off with those and to give us a little bit of a flavor of what kinds of questions that are coming up. So the first scenario, the wife just had her first baby, and after that the fighting and cursing is escalating. He doesn't take care of the baby ever. And a friend bought some food to help the new family, and he threw out the food because he doesn't like to be a taker. But on the other hand, he doesn't make or buy warm food, so she ends up eating yogurt and sandwiches that she made by herself. He also doesn't like her mother, so he doesn't let her come by to help, and he doesn't let her talk to her friends on the phone when he's home. But she's free to do whatever she wants when he's not home. So she's upset, and she second-guesses everything. Is this abuse? Let me just do one more scenario, and then we'll jump into the more of the conversation. Another scenario. She can never get anything right. If she doesn't fold the towels correctly, he'll throw them out of the closet. And if she's lucky, this time he won't slap her. One time she gave away all the desserts after a dinner party, and he wanted some, so he threw all the dinner plates at the wall, one by one, narrowly missing her. If she buys an outfit, he complains it's too expensive or too cheap. He's never happy. If it's too cheap, meaning that people will think that he's poor, that's why she's buying those kind of clothes. He's never happy. He's always belittling her tastes, her efforts, just her in general. Is this abuse? Mm-hmm. So we'll discuss that. Hopefully that's the point of the call. But let's just start with another question. So abuse is abuse. I mean, it just feels horrible. It's painful and hard. What's the difference? What type of abuse there is? You want to just talk about the different types of ways that people feel abused?
Sure. I think it's probably helpful to backtrack a bit of a step and contrast the idea of abuse or the types of abuse that we're going to be categorizing first by beginning with, what would be a healthy marriage or a healthy relationship. And I think that will then help us understand, what are some of the contrasts for that. So a healthy marriage is where each spouse is feeling the responsibility to consider and to take care of each other emotionally, spiritually, physically, psychologically. When we have this, we can refer to this relationship as being healthy or a functional marriage because both partners are functioning in their roles, fulfilling their goals of a healthy relationship, getting their needs met, and giving their needs to each other. This doesn't mean that anybody's doing this perfectly. There's no such thing as a perfect marriage because there's no such thing as a perfect human being. But that's the overall picture and dynamic and pattern of the relationship. I'm there for you. You're there for me. I matter to you. You matter to me. I can count on you. You can count on me. And so that's healthy and that's functional. So we can contrast that with unhealthy relationships where the one or both spouses are not abiding by this. There isn't an ability to count on each other or to feel like there is reliability. or that you matter to me, or that you feel like I matter to you. And obviously, when this happens, this could manifest in many, many different ways. But now we're talking about a relationship that's either unhealthy or has unhealthiness in it. When this breakdown in functioning happens, sometimes it can happen in such a way that feels so bad that the person experiencing it, or both people, can call it abusive or feel like it's abusive. And then potentially we could be wondering if this is domestic abuse. Is this a relationship that we would categorize as being one that is an abusive one? So when this happens, this could typically happen for one of two categories. Either the one or both people in the relationship don't have the proper attitude or perspective about what marriage, what a relationship is all about, what a healthy marriage is all about. There's a certain self-centered expectation that marriage is about what I'm going to get, what I want, what I need, versus what I'm going to give. So that's one potential factor for what for what can account for dysfunction and problems relationally. And then there are various mental illnesses or mental health issues that will also account for unhealthiness in a relationship. But now we get to concerns about abuse. And so it's important to have some words or descriptors that will help us differentiate. So the first one that we're going to talk about is what I call situational couple violence. Okay, so this is domestic violence where the violence could be initiated equally by men or women, by the husband or the wife, and it's not categorized by a pattern of coercive control, and we're going to get back to that in a minute. Okay, so there can be abusive behavior with words, verbally. There could be abusive behavior with finances. There could be some intimidating behavior. There could be other forms of inappropriate, unhealthy, problematic behavior, but it isn't potentially all on one person, and it isn't being driven by this fundamental engine that we're calling coercive control. So this situational couple violence is obviously a serious concern of dysfunction, unhealthiness in a relationship, right? Anything that includes physical abuse, intimidation, child abuse, verbal abuse, emotional, psychological, social isolation. These are things that will all be, we can term them as abusive behaviors, but they can also take place within this pattern, this problematic pattern of a relationship that we would call situational couple violence. It tends to be in those kind of relationships, it tends to be situation specific. It's not necessarily one person specific, and even if it typically is one person who has a specific behavior, it isn't being driven from a place of a need for or a desire for establishing and maintaining control. And then we have what's known popularly as domestic abuse or domestic violence, or what I tend to call more specifically intimate partner terrorism. Okay, because this really allows us to differentiate this form of abusive relationship patterns from the previous one. And this is where there's a pattern of coercive control, where one person in the relationship is deliberately exercising over the other partner control in order to dominate, in order to get their way, and committing behaviors that are either physically harmful or arouse fear in the other person, in order to prevent that person from doing what they want, or in order to compel that person to behave in ways that he or she wouldn't freely choose. Okay, so in dysfunction, the focus is typically on the self, right? If John is the dysfunctional partner, then John is acting self-centered. John tends to see his own needs without seeing the needs of his partner. Whereas in intimate partner terrorism, even though there is an element of this, the primary core focus is that there's an attitude and an assumption of entitlement in order to really dominate the partner. So in the situation of intimate partner terrorism, John is going to potentially do any of the behaviors we mentioned before, any of the categories of behaviors we mentioned before, physical, psychological, emotional, financial, all these forms of abusive behavior. But what there is in addition to that is this driven agenda of establishing control and using fear or the implied threat to maintain fear, to establish fear in order to maintain the control. What we also know is that in intimate partner terrorism, there is often emotional abuse, with or without physical abuse, that will over time alter the victim, the other partner's view of themselves, their relationships, and their place in the world. So their sense of self over time and their sense of self-worth begins to erode, begins to deteriorate. And this enables, this deepens the perpetrator's ability to continue to assert their dominance and maintain their control in the relationship pattern. So what winds up happening is this specific pattern of psychological abuse results in the victim becoming demoralized and trapped in the abusive behavior, in the abusive relationship. Also, another thing to note is that in these types of abusive relationships, which we're talking about intimate partner terrorism, there doesn't necessarily always have to be a high level or a high frequency of physical violence. Sometimes the actual physical violence could be fairly infrequently or a low level of it, but the fear, the implied threat, is always going to be present. So with that said, if we go back to the scenarios that you just asked about, we can differentiate a little bit. So let's start with the first scenario. There's fighting, there's cursing, there's neglect, there's parental neglect. He's not taking care of the baby. He throws out the food, and he seems controlling. He doesn't like to be a taker, even though she may want the food, but he throws it out. Doesn't help out. Doesn't like her mother, so he doesn't let her come by. So there's another aspect of abusive behavior, which is isolation. Doesn't let her talk to her friends on the phone, more isolation. She can do what she wants during the day, but then at some point he expects her to go back to work and leave the baby with a babysitter, which, if that's not what she wants to do, is also definitely problematic behavior. And then the scenario ends with she's afraid to upset him, so she second-guesses everything. So we certainly have a relationship that's deeply problematic. And we would need, obviously, to be able to speak and for somebody to do a thorough assessment with the partner in this relationship to really understand, A, the history and the pattern of these behaviors, and B, the nature of the fear that's being described in this scenario. But if the fear over here really means that she's literally afraid of him, and that he knows this, that he uses this fear deliberately in order to maintain his behaviors and to have his way, then we certainly have some form of intimate partner terrorism. But it's also possible, again, without knowing the actual situation and doing a thorough assessment, that we're talking about a relationship that has very, very significant dysfunction with significant patterns of abusive behavior, and that there could still be the perpetrator, the guy in this scenario, the man who's doing these behaviors, that he still may be open and amenable to intervention if his behaviors are not being driven by this, by like what we talked about in intimate partner terrorism, by this need for the control and using fear in order to maintain that power and control. What we know about intimate partner terrorism from the research is that approximately 90 to 95% of the time in such relationships, the perpetrator is a male as opposed to a female. But what we know in situational couple violence, where there isn't that pattern of that underlying pattern of threat and fear in order to maintain control, there is no significant gender difference. We know that there are dysfunctional relationships where there are harmful, abusive behaviors that are happening within the context of the relationship that can be initiated or perpetrated equally by the husband or the wife, by the male or the female. So it's just important to understand and to appreciate that we can have relationships where there's abusive behavior taking place, and that definitely the relationship needs help, and it isn't healthy. It could be even downright toxic. And yet the relationship could be open and amenable to intervention with the right help for one, both, or the couple together. Whereas when we're talking about intimate partner terrorism, then and there's this element of threat and fear specifically for the driven agenda of power and control, this is not a situation that is likely to be very amenable to traditional couples therapy, statistically, the perpetrator in those kind of relationships is not open and amenable to real intervention, and it's a much, much more toxic and complicated dynamic to deal with. Just to end with a comment or two about the other scenario that you mentioned, just to go through that, use it in the same way that we just went through the first one. So you mentioned in that scenario she can't get anything right, so there's obviously a dynamic of constant criticism, verbal and emotional abuse. He'll throw the towels out of the closet if it doesn't go the way he wants. And then another aspect that's added in this scenario is that if she's lucky, he won't slap her this time. So now you have actual physical violence, which is most definitely a progression. From a clinical perspective, certainly when there's actual physical violence taking place, then that's considered a significant progression, a whole other level of severity of abusiveness. And throwing the dinner plates, breaking the plates, throwing them at her, narrowly missing her. So we have a whole other level of danger potentially in the dynamic of the perpetrator in scenario number 2. And it certainly seems more to be pointing in the direction of intimate partner terrorism. But again, as with any situation, ultimately, a skilled, competent professional in these areas who can do a really thorough evaluation, zero in on the right questions to be asking to determine, what's the best way to proceed, how to best be of help.
Thank you. Well, so when someone is encountering that as a bystander, whether it's a family member, a neighbor, and they're seeing this thing these kind of situations happening, what can they do, and does it really matter to what they can do to help, what the origin of this abuse is?
Right, that's a great question. So if I'm understanding you properly, the question is, does it matter what is actually the difference in the actual relationship pattern, one way or the other? We're relatives, we're neighbors, what have you. We see that there's a problem. There's clearly something unhealthy happening here, inappropriate. Nobody should be spoken or treated to that way. And what's the role? What can someone in that situation do for someone who's stuck in that, who's dealing with that? Right? That's the question. That's
the question, but, and I guess part of the question is also, does that neighbor or friend or family member need to know what type of abuse it is, if it's the terrorism or just dysfunction? Right.
Okay, so for example, let's try to answer both questions. For example, if the relationship in fact is one of dysfunction, then self-help might be an option, right? Somebody being able to read a book, getting educated, being able to use that information for their own benefit to help change the situation for themselves, for their relationship, may be possible. The situations where we're talking about domestic violence, and certainly when it's the more severe types of violence or the intimate partner terrorism, then it becomes a lot more complicated. And so I think that it's important for us to appreciate that the bystander, the relative, they can't possibly be able in that, from the vantage point that they're in and from the lack of actual training that they have, right? They don't have the training. We can't expect them to be able to identify or have the responsibility to identify. So what we need to do is identify the types of dysfunction versus situational couple violence versus intimate partner terrorism. It's not on anybody else other than the professionals that the couple or the people or the individuals in the coupleship would go to. It's not on anyone else as a responsibility to evaluate this and to determine that. But in terms of what can be done, so there's some general guidelines that we can highlight that are fairly universal, so that in any situation these would just be appropriate, helpful guidelines to keep in mind. So I'm going to share some of the things to do versus some of the things not to do, some of the attitudes to have versus some of the attitudes not to have. So first of all, one important idea is that it's really important to have the mindset of what I call a server, not a fixer or a helper. Because people that come to this situation from the mindset of fixer or helper are vulnerable to giving advice where that's not really warranted or needed, or appreciated. They are vulnerable to intervening where the people involved don't want them to, or it would be actually safer for them not to get involved. But when we approach from the standpoint of a server, from the mindset of a server, then I'm not here to fix. I'm not here to be a superhero. I'm not here to rescue. I'm not here to solve the world's problems. I'm here to serve. And automatically, in the mindset of a server, the question comes into mind is, how can I serve? And so our ears open up. We become receptive to investigating, to understanding, and to listening. So in the context of the attitude, of the mindset of being a server, then what happens is we believe in the importance and the ability of the woman in that situation, the victim, to make her own decisions, and to understand that the role of the server is to provide information, if there's information to be provided, but not advice, to give resources, to give help when help is asked for, to establish and to maintain appropriate relational boundaries, to mostly listen instead of speaking. But when a person is in the mindset of the helper or the fixer, so then we're vulnerable to thinking that the victim is helpless and needs somebody to think for her, is vulnerable to intervening according to the helper or fixer's own assessment of what's appropriate or what should be done or what's needed, is vulnerable to giving help or offering an opinion that's not being asked for, is vulnerable to pushing forward with some sort of an intervention that the woman is not necessarily ready for or at this point interested in, tends to give advice instead of giving information, and is going to work harder ultimately than the person who's in that situation. Meaning there are some situations where the person who's in it needs to be able to experience and process in their own way and in their own time with supportive people that they choose and that they feel safe with and trust in order to come to their own clarity and to their own decisions about how to proceed. And if somebody is in the mindset of the fixer or the helper and with good intentions becomes directive in that process, then they may actually be undermining this person's ability to really stay with their own clarity and with their own state of readiness for whatever they determine they need or what they're ready for. Was that clear?
Yeah. So another kind of angle of the same question is, clarify this. People say if it's controlling type of abuse, there's no hope, there's no help, and get out. I know it's going to be slow and hard, but get out. And if it's dysfunction, then it's possible to work on it. So the type of serving and the type of information that one pulls together might be slightly different, or is that off?
Well, so a couple of comments. Firstly, how do we determine if something is controlling? So it's easy to look at many types of abusive behaviors and call them controlling behaviors, but the behaviors themselves may just be part of inappropriate dysfunctional patterns as opposed to really being driven by the fundamental agenda of wanting control and of the willingness to dominate and to create threat and fear in order to maintain that control. So I think it's overly simplistic. It's easy to do this, especially because it's situations of violence in partnerships and couples and abusive behavior is provocative. It's deeply, deeply provocative. We become very reactive to it and we care very much. But it's easy to react to seeing or hearing about a specific behavior, which in and of itself should appropriately be called an abusive behavior, and say because that's an abusive behavior, this person is an abuser. And typically, popularly, when people say that, they're referring to this notion of the abuser, quote unquote, is this person that I'm referring to as in the intimate partner terrorism. That may or may not be accurate. And the good news is that most of the time it's not accurate. There are many more problematic dysfunctional relationships where there's even abusive behaviors that are taking place that are not necessarily the intimate partner terrorism, where fundamentally there's a real investment by the perpetrator of the abuse to maintain the power and control, willing to use violence and fear in the service of that. Unfortunately, one situation of intimate partner terrorism is too much. But just to be able to see an abusive behavior is not, it's overly simplistic to feel like we can sort of diagnose, for lack of a better, I don't mean that literally because this isn't a diagnostic term, but to label and to diagnose that person as the abuser. If we just mean it colloquially, the abuser as in the person who's perpetrated the abusive behavior, then that's fine. That's factual. If we know this person as, not giving his wife money to buy food, then he's treating her abusively. That is that's factual. But typically, when we use that word abuser, people mean something beyond just the behavior itself, and there's a category that this person or the relationship is being placed in. Again, I think that when it comes to intervention, if people around them, especially non-professionals, can just understand and appreciate the difference of having the mindset of server versus fixer and helper, then we maintain an open ear to hearing directly from the person who's in that situation, who's struggling, who's suffering, with what they want, what's their own assessment, what do they know is best right now, what's timely, what are they ready for, what's safe, et cetera, et cetera.
So following that, firstly, this is a quick question. Is the common understanding is that if there's physical violence, you hit me once, you're out, or I'm out. Is that because it's domestic abuse, and domestic abuse can never be solved?
I don't know. There's no rule that exists anywhere that says that. If there's you hit me once, I'm out. Somebody could just as easily say, you lie to me once, I'm out. You cheat on me once, I'm out. You steal money, and I don't. There's no. A relationship is as successful as the two people that are in it, and a relationship stays alive for as long as the two people that are in it will it to be. So there's no rule that we should be using sort of as an objective, unquestioned measure. The people that are in the relationship need to determine if they're in or out. And as difficult as it may be for us on the outside to see somebody who we know, for example, has gotten physically abused, and that we may feel very, very strongly this person needs to go. But that is not the mindset of a server. And it's the mindset of a fixer or a rescuer, somebody who knows better. But ultimately, the person who's in that relationship needs to be able to have the supportiveness and the safety and the care to be able to sort it through, explore their options, and determine what's best for them.
Okay. Going back a little bit more to help everybody understand a little bit more about domestic abuse with a capital A, is there a time when it typically starts or accelerates, or does it happen the day after Sheva Brachos?
So just to make clear, when you say with a capital A, you mean specifically the intimate partner terrorism kind of dynamic that I was describing?
Yes.
Okay. So I don't know that I can say that there's one typical scenario. What I will say, though, is that I can share with you some characteristics of the typical male. Again, these are just sort of a profile based on the research that we have of sort of the typical male profile of the perpetrator of those things. And maybe that'll shed a little bit of light. Hang on a moment. Let me pull up my note here about that. But certainly this is not stuff that's blatant early on in the relationship. In looking back, the victim will be able to see warning signs or things that they sort of quelled or squished, concerns, feelings, or scenarios that took place earlier on, even in dating. It's possible that we could look back and see that. It's also possible that the person played the perfect gentleman, and that there wasn't any real warning signs until the marriage was fully established. Will all relationships, will the abuse come out from Sheva Brachos? I don't think that we can assume that. I think that fairly quickly, though, when we're talking about somebody who is really driven in this intimate partner terrorism, is really driven to dominate and to assert power and control, we are going to see those patterns come out earlier rather than later. And some of these, there are different subtypes. Some of these, perpetrators or intimate partner terrorists are going to behave fairly civilly and appropriately and benignly, so long as they have no reason to do otherwise. In other words, if their spouse, if their partner doesn't give them cause to be reactive to them, to react negatively, then they're not necessarily just waking up in the morning and out of fun and tickles torturing their spouse. And they only assert their perpetration in reaction to a perceived slight or disrespect from their spouse, from the victim. And then there are others, unfortunately, that are, the behavior seems a bit more sociopathic in the sense that they do have their own desire to assert control or dominance or the fear, even when there isn't necessarily some sort of seeming trigger or provocation to that. So there's different possible dynamics that can happen within the, as you called it, the domestic abuse with a capital A.
Mm-hmm. So again, something you touched on for just a second in the beginning of the talk, can the abuser or the one who's causing the harm of in dysfunction, can he or she change?
Mm-hmm. Well, as a clinician, I would say that the biggest, most important part that involves human change is the desire, the authentic willingness from a person to make change from within. So that's going to be an important factor. What we know, generally speaking, is that in intimate partner terrorism, again, the most severe, most problematic, most complicated dynamics of domestic abuse patterns, of domestic abuse situations, the perpetrators are typically not available for intervention. Typically, they're fairly skilled at eluding arrest or getting in trouble. When they do get involved in intervention, the success rate is fairly slim. But for people that behave inappropriately and even abusively, where it isn't necessarily being driven by that need for power and control, along with the willingness, the readiness to use threat or actual physical harm, if it's to a lower degree, to a lesser degree, then potentially they are open and amenable to intervention. And this speaks to a whole larger conversation in understanding and in appreciating the phenomenon of domestic abuse, domestic violence, that it can't simply be seen as, which therapist are we going to send him to, or the two of them to, who's going to help. Domestic abuse occurs within a larger sociological reality, and that intervention needs to be appreciated and understood in a much broader sense. So intervention could mean literally, a clinical intervention of a therapist getting involved, but intervention can also mean that a rabbi has gotten involved, or there are family members that are involved, or that there's community messages and community support for appropriate, respectful relationship behavior and not supportive of domestic abuse behaviors. So I just want us to appreciate intervention in the broadest sense of the word when we speak about this.
So this question just came in. Is narcissism domestic abuse or terrorism when he treats her like garbage?
Well, I assume that the questioner means narcissism in the clinical sense of somebody who's being diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, I would assume. Right. But I can tell you as a clinician that there are people who have narcissistic personality disorder that will not necessarily do these behaviors. And then there are people who absolutely don't have the diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder who do these behaviors. So I think it's a mistake or just simply maybe a lack of complete understanding. So if narcissism is meant sort of colloquially to just mean sort of a selfish or a self-centered person, then obviously we can call, it would be easy to say that anybody that behaves this way and treats somebody this way is a selfish or self-centered person. But if we mean it in the clinical sense, I think it's important to understand that this phenomenon of domestic abuse, of situational couple violence, as well as intimate partner terrorism, is not specific to any one diagnosis in any way, shape, or form. Okay, so if you look in the ICD, which is the physician's diagnostic manual, if you look in the DSM, which is the psychiatric diagnostic manual, you're not going to find diagnoses of a specific disorder that accounts for domestic abuse behaviors, intimate partner terrorism. You can have a person, we could sit here and we can talk about some of the potential personality issues that a person may have, but it's a mistake to simply think that if a person does have narcissistic personality, then they're perpetrating these behaviors, or that everybody who perpetrates these behaviors has narcissistic personality disorder. So I'm not sure if that fully answered the question. Tell me if it did.
It answered it for me, but I didn't ask the question.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. So again, sometimes when we're looking at a situation as a bystander and there's abuse coming from both ends, how can we differentiate who and what and how, or what to do in that situation?
Right. Again, it sounds, like I'm saying with all of these scenarios, a closer, proper evaluation or look is always warranted to be able to give a more definitive, understanding. But just from the description of it, it sounds like it's more likely a description of a dynamic of situational couple violence. And situational couple violence, if you have a couple, you can have, I've met couples like this where there's ongoing situational couple violence, and yet at the end of the day there's a strong attachment or commitment to the coupleship, to the marriage. There can even be, as strange or as sick as it may sound, there can even fundamentally be underneath it strong feelings of affection and care for each other. And there could be all sorts of variables from a clinical perspective as to why this couple behaves so inappropriately or dysfunctionally with each other, where it gets to situations where they trigger and become reactive to each other, and then there's violent behavior. But the bottom line is that you can have a couple with situational couple violence that could be very appropriate and amenable for couples intervention, for couples counseling. Or you may have other situations where some individual therapy needs to take place first, or concurrently at the same time. And again, in order to really know, that couple would really need to, be seen face-to-face with a competent professional to determine that. But just theoretically speaking, if the scenario is describing situational couple violence, if there's a commitment, if there's an interest in the relationship to better themselves, to better their marriage, then potentially good, appropriate couples counseling could be an appropriate intervention.
So another question that came in. Some people don't want to go to professionals. They want to only work with a RUV.
Mm-hmm.
Is it, what do you, as a professional who's seen people who started off working with a RUV and these deep, complex issues, is it possible to work through even situational violence with the RUV or unprofessional or quasi-professional?
Well, look, it's my perspective that the typical term shalom bias or shalom bias issues that people typically use, or Rabbanim will typically use, is not talking about situations that warrant clinical intervention. And there are situations where couples can benefit greatly from going to the Rav who they trust, who they turn to, who they rely on. And the Rav has wisdom and Seichel HaYashar and Torah knowledge to be able to guide them. And I have no doubt that many Rabbanim today and for years have helped countless couples just directly through rabbinical counseling. But when we're talking about situations where there's a degree of clinical relevance, there's a serious aspect of dysfunction, either in the relationship and or within the individuals themselves, then any competent Rav, any wise, grounded Rav would be the first probably to say that, you guys need to see a professional. I don't know Rabbanim that would meet somebody who's describing a heart problem and think that they would want to, make an appointment by me tomorrow. Don't go to the cardiologist and see me. I don't know any Rav that would do that. I don't know any Rav that would do it any differently with this.
Has me into doing sexual things I'm not comfortable with, and when I don't, he gets mad at me or guilt trips me, so sometimes I do. He consistently disregards my wants and calls me spoiled and stubborn. He doesn't see the problem at all with his behavior, but this makes me depressed. Isn't this abuse?
Yeah, so again, I think that we could do this with many types or the categories of abuse. There's no question that this is abusive behavior, and there's no question that it's inappropriate, and there's no question that it's harmful. She's becoming depressed. She's deeply distressed by it. But if we're talking about, are we talking about a situation of intimate partner terrorism, then we may or we may not be. And there's a good chance, I would say a better chance than none, just statistically speaking, that we're not talking about intimate partner terrorism. We're talking about serious dysfunction. We're talking about somebody who's definitely going to need some serious education and appreciation about healthy sexual relationship between couples and understanding his wife and how to engage with her, how to seduce her, so to speak, in a way that is reaffirming to her for herself personally and for the relationship. And so obviously intervention would be appropriate over here. But just from the scenario itself, it would be tempting to listen to a situation where somebody is sort of blatantly doing something that we would call abusive behavior and just simplify it by saying, okay, so he's an abuser and there's nothing more that could be done. But that's not necessarily the case. And there could be, I don't want to go into speculation about this because a little information could be a dangerous thing. But as a clinician, I can clinically speculate to a whole number of potential understandings of what might be going on for the guy and what kind of interventions might be helpful if they were being seen, if they were gotten, if they were in the right hands and they were seeking help and interested in help, whether it's the intervention would be the two of them together or just him alone. Again, it would depend on many variables. There would be no one universal applied intervention. It would really depend on the actual couple, on the individuals.
Another question, what about the children? In a situation of situational abuse or dysfunction and there's a decision to stay in the marriage, what do the children observe and what's the best way to protect the children?
Right, well, so any exposure to violence, it doesn't matter from a child's perspective what category of dysfunction or problem their parents' relationship is. Being exposed to violence in any way, shape, or form is deeply traumatic and problematic for a child. In fact, there are laws. I'm not an attorney, and I'm not going to get into specifics. It would be out of my purview. But there are laws protecting the safety of children and holding adults, parents, accountable, and even in some states holding a victim accountable to maintaining their responsibility for the safety of a child, because we understand that there is a concept of secondary exposure. And even if a child is not being directly physically harmed, but witnessing abusive behavior, whether it's physical or it's any other form of abusive behavior, is harmful for a child. So children, unfortunately, are always the victims, so to speak, in their exposure to any sort of abusive pattern in a relationship. And hopefully the fact that children exist can be appealed to the parents, to their love and their concern and their care for the children in their seeking appropriate help and appropriate intervention. Unless there's a more specific
follow-up
question.
To that question,
mm-hmm.
If someone doesn't consider the children, is there help for that person?
If somebody, who's
someone
the somebody?
I guess what they're saying is if the abuser, or maybe they're both dysfunctional or whatever, and one of them is, or one or both doesn't consider the children, is there help for this family? Meaning, I guess that if it's not enough of a push to want to make change, if the children not enough of a push to make change, then what might be, or is there any chance that there's something that's going to be even bigger a push for them to make some change?
Mm-hmm. So the question is sort of implying the notion that that the way to get this person or couple to get change, to get help, is through leverage, and that the fact that their children are involved would hypothetically be sufficient leverage. And here the situation is so extreme that that's not even sufficient leverage. But I would really urge us to try to stay away from that type of thinking. That type of thinking really does reflect the fixer, helper, rescuer mentality as opposed to the server mentality. And I'm hard-pressed to believe that most people on this planet that have children, as dysfunctional as a situation may be, don't love and want what's best for their children. And so it's very easy for us to make snap judgments from an outside perspective and say this person is or isn't this or isn't willing to do that. But reality is thankfully usually more complex than that. It's going to be difficult for us to dispense some sort of magical advice to somebody who's on the outside that if you just say this or you go from that angle, then that will be the right thing to do or to say to get the right response, that you're looking for, which is obviously that the couple or the individual would be open to going for help. So obviously we can't give some sort of magical formula, but I would just caution us not to see it in this way of, the children are the leverage, but if the children are not the leverage, then what's going to work? Because we're thinking from the place of we're going to make this happen, but we're not going to make anything happen. If these are people that we are connected to sufficiently, that there's a real connection and there's a relationship, then like I highlighted before, the characteristics of being present for the couple or for the wife, whoever's involved, whoever it's relevant for, from the position of server is really how we need to be tuned into this, really what would ultimately be most effective and most helpful.
Are there statistics of how many cases in the firm world are the terrorism versus dysfunction?
I doubt it. Statistics in the firm world in general are hard to come by. And if they do exist, I don't know of them. But I'm doubtful that we have real numbers to answer that question.
So I guess then just anecdotally, are most of the cases that the layperson might call abusive, are they really domestic abuse or are they dysfunction?
We know that it's generally speaking in the population, I have no reason to believe that in the firm world it would be any different, that generally speaking, when we take any kind of situation, whether we go by the police records, the statistics that the law has, or clinicians, the clinical research that's done, we know that most dynamics that involve some form of abuse behavior or violence goes more under, it's more frequently situational couple violence than the intimate partner terrorism, which thankfully is the case because then we're talking about more abusive behaviors in the context of dysfunction. And I don't in any way mean to minimize both the concerns about that or the suffering or the pain that people may be in that. I want to be really clear about that. But the ramifications for a relationship that has dysfunction for individuals or for even for the coupleship in terms of situational couple violence is a different kind of situation, with different ramifications than intimate partner terrorism. So I wish I could say offhand what those numbers would be. I don't know, in terms of, proportionally what is the numbers of situational couple violence versus intimate partner terrorism. I could tell you, though, that it's significantly more frequently situational couple violence in some way. So I guess in a simpler statement, what I can say, the implication of what I'm trying to say in a simple way is that there are many situations that would seem to us to be, sort of blatantly clear, not helpable, where that's not factually so.
Okay, that's a very important point, especially for those bystanders. That
correct.
We don't know enough. We don't know enough of the story, and we also don't know enough to be to diagnose what the situation is. So again, be a server, and definitely don't say you're in an abusive relationship. You got to get out.
Right. I mean, abusive relationship is this catch-all kind of a phrase, but really, I'm hoping that I'm impressing this evening some distinctions that we can appreciate. It isn't quite, just black and white. There's abusive behavior, so there's this umbrella kind of term and category to put the person in. It's thankfully much more complex and nuanced than that, and that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It means that most of the time, if and when people are safe and ready and get to the right people, help can be available for many situations, and improvement can, progress can happen.
So I guess in summary, it's don't tell someone to leave their marriage. You don't know. You never tell someone to leave their marriage.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And especially because you don't know what you probably don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, in the simplest way, I mean, just even strategically speaking, even if we absolutely believe, that it is the right thing to say or the right thing for this person to do. Human nature is such that if I tell a person that's in that situation, leave your marriage, the first thing they do psychologically and emotionally is dig in their heels and give me reasons why I shouldn't and why he's such a wonderful guy or what I have to lose. It's absolutely poor understanding of human psychology. At the most simplest of levels, that's not the way we engage someone in the process of change. It's literally like being a bull in a china shop, that kind of approach. So even if we're absolutely certain that this is what's best and what's right, number one, it's not our right, as you just said. Adults have to determine their own way. But even if we care so deeply for this person and have such clarity, it's just simply not a skillful way of engaging someone in the process of change. And for most people, difficult change, whether it's an addictive habit or a difficult ingrained habit or a relationship, which is a very significant part of someone's life, change doesn't happen overnight. It happens in a process gradually over a long period of time. And nobody's changing because someone said change.
And also on the flip of it, what I'm encountering now is that people are telling others, you don't realize you're in an abusive relationship, you have to get out. Or just people saying that rather than telling people this might be dysfunction or someone has to learn some new skills, people are saying you're helping them realize, and I'm saying that in quotes, helping them realize that they're in an abusive relationship.
Yeah, I have no doubt that people that are doing that have the best of intentions, and whether they're coming from their own personal experiences and background or just care, and they really feel like this is most helpful. But it's important, like the phrase "a bull in a china shop." It's important to really be appreciative of the fact that we're unintentionally robbing people of their own intelligence and their own sense of agency when we tell them what they're going through and we tell them what they need to do about it. What we can do is give information. What we can do is educate. What we can do is listen. What we can do is offer resources. What we can do is give assistance or help when it's asked for, when it's seeked out. And that's just fundamentally good human behavior in any situation, including this.
So on those same lines, people say, but she's in denial, so I have to help her see that.
I'm sorry?
She's in denial. She's in denial that she's being abused, and which sometimes does happen, is that she doesn't recognize what's happening, or she's just denial sometimes is an easy mechanism to just not deal with something. So she feels that she has to help her realize what's going on.
Right, but again, denial, is one of those words that has a clinical implication, or we could just use it sort of colloquially. But denial, as from a psychological perspective, is a defense mechanism. So it's human nature to deny a reality when they are simply not yet ready to deal with the truth of that reality. So by us thinking that we're now going to spell it out and it's all going to become crystal clear to the person is completely not appreciating what a defense mechanism does and what it's serving for the person. So at best, it's not going to be effective. At worst, it could create a lot more damage and harm than benefit and good. So if there's truly denial happening, the meaning that a person is denying as a result of their own defense, their own psychological and emotional defense, they're denying a reality that is truly happening, then what they need from people that are there to help them is a lot of safety and a lot of care and a lot of supportiveness and a lot of space to be able to, over time, own and acknowledge the truth for themselves.
So, in no circumstances is it worthwhile or advised or even acceptable to be telling someone what's going on for them and to tell them what to do.
I think it's very, very dangerous when we inadvertently start playing God for other people's lives.
Let me just check out the last few questions that came in. I'm trying to clarify his opinion on intervention. In the beginning, he mentioned that a family member should be a server, but he mentioned at another point that there should be intervention, which my understanding is the opposite of a server.
Well, I don't remember exactly what I said about that, but in the context of the idea of a server, I wasn't trying to say that intervention can't be offered or mentioned or educated about, but the attitude of being a server means that I am primarily listening. And if I'm listening, then I'm really hearing if this person is seeking the information, if this person is ready for an offer for help, what type of assistance or help this person is looking for or ready for or interested in, so that if there's an intervention, quote unquote, that's being now spoken about or engaged, it's actually matching the reality of what the victim is wanting and is ready for and is needing. It's not matching my own wants, my own agenda, my own ideas. That was what I was trying to convey.
Okay, here's another question. Why is it worth the time examining if it's abuse or dysfunction? If she doesn't want to change and won't change, and there's harm being done, shouldn't she just leave anyway?
Well, that's a dilemma for the person that's exactly the dilemma for a person who's in that reality to have to sort through. But it's their dilemma to sort through. It isn't anyone else's. Mm-hmm. So nobody's denying the truth of that, the idea of that. If somebody's in a relationship and, inappropriate or unacceptable behavior is taking place and the person who's doing it doesn't seem to be interested in making change, then it's true. Nobody has to sit there and analyze, is it this category or that category? And they get to sit and determine what the ramifications are for them and what they want to do for themselves. But the primary point I'm trying to drive home is that what that person in that situation needs from people around them is a supportiveness and a respectfulness for them to be able to go through that process, which may take a short amount of time and it may take years. And the result of that, whenever it is, may not be the result that we think should happen or that we would want should happen. And are we prepared for that? Are we prepared to just simply be supportive to this person as they navigate their own life? Or do we think we know better for someone else? That's what I'm trying to sensitize us to.
And this last question that came in, a neighbor is abusing his wife and children and home. Do I have the duty to call ACS? How does it work?
Okay, so that's the first thing I'll say is that's a legal question. It's not a clinical question. So I will say what I believe is the answer, but I want to make it clear I'm not an attorney, and this is a legal question. But I believe that the idea of having a obligation to report is what we call, at least in New York, certainly a mandated reporter. There may be other states may have a different term for that. And typically people that are just neighbors, what have you, are not mandated reporters. They're not legally obligated. There are people that are in specific positions, for example, mental health professionals in the context of working professionally with a person that are what are called mandated reporters. And there are other people that go into that category as well. So that's as far as I can go in answering that. If there's more nuances or whatever, we're getting into legalities.
But on that note, it might be worthwhile to bring it to the attention of someone in the community who can possibly do something, whether it's the person's Rav or this is all a separate conversation.
I don't know. My first inclination would be that if I see a parent that's mistreating their child, my first inclination would be, why wouldn't I approach the parent in a respectful, non-threatening manner to convey my concern and to offer support or to inquire about how I could be of help or what might be helpful. I don't see why I would immediately go any other way. I mean, obviously each situation is specific, and there may be reasons why in one situation a person can't do that or knows that's not the way to go. So obviously every situation has to be treated specifically and uniquely for its own reality. But just the mentality of it, generally speaking, the first assumption should be, let's just approach the person directly, but in a caring, respectful, appropriate kind of a way. In other words, if I see somebody perpetrate, it's absolutely not a justification for me to become a perpetrator on the perpetrator. Intolerance doesn't justify someone else, my intolerance.
Sure. Wow. Okay. So thank you. You gave a lot to think about for those who are dealing with this or have neighbors, families dealing with this. I think it clarifies several issues that were coming up. I think this is a good way for us to kind of sum up the domestic abuse that we awareness and education that we started for the spring. We're off for the summer, and if anyone has any questions over the summer, please do email us, and we'll try to get you the answers. If you send them to us anonymously, obviously we can't help you. We might be able to include it in a future article, but it's easier if we have your contact information, if it's something that you really want us to possibly help you with. If it's just ideas for future calls, then that's the way anonymous works. So thank you, David, for talking to us and providing us a lot of insights. And thank you
You're
all
very
for
welcome.
joining us tonight.
It's been my pleasure and honor.